Look down at any railway track, and you'll see two steel rails running side by side. The distance between them looks arbitrary, but it isn't. That gap is called the gauge, and on most of the world's railways, it's exactly 1,435 millimeters. For feet, 8.5 inches. An oddly specific number that shaped wars, bankrupted railways, and still divides the map today. This is why track gauge matters. First, what exactly are we measuring? Track gauge is the distance between the inner faces of the two rails, not the centers, the inside edges. And it's measured at a precise point, 14 millimeters below the top of the rail, just under the rounded corner, so that wear and rounding can't corrupt the reading. Get this number wrong by even a little, and the consequences are immediate. Engineers actually track two gauges. Static gauge is the rails at rest. Dynamic gauge is what happens under a moving train, as the wheel flanges push the rails apart. Let it spread too far, and a wheel set can drop straight between the rails. Let it pinch too narrow, and the flanges ride up and over the railhead. Either way, the result is the same word every railway dreads: derailment. So where did that strange number come from? You may have heard it traces back to the wheel ruts of Roman war chariots. It's a great story, and it's a myth. The real answer is humbler. Standard gauge was inherited from the coal wagon tramways of northern England and fixed by one man, George Stephenson. He'd built his early lines to 4 feet 8. Widening them by just half an inch let the wheels run with less friction and binding, and that half inch became the world standard. But why does the width matter so much beyond just fitting the wheels? Physics. On a curve, a train is flung outward by centrifugal force, mass times velocity squared, divided by the radius. Engineers fight that by banking the track, called cant. But the gauge itself is part of the equation. A wider stance gives the vehicle a larger restoring moment, more leverage against tipping over. So wider gauge means more stability, taller loads, heavier freight. Narrow gauge gives that up, but gains the ability to wind through tight mountain curves. That single trade-off splits the world's railways into 3 families. Standard gauge, 1, 4, 3, 5. Anything wider is broad gauge. Anything narrower is narrow gauge. And standard is exactly what its name suggests. It carries about 60% of all the railway on Earth. But the other 40% is where the story gets interesting. Here are the big ones. Russian gauge, 1,520 millimeters, runs across the former Soviet world, nearly 14% of global track. Indian gauge, 1676, is the widest in mass use, built for enormous passenger loads and heavy freight. Then the narrow gauges, Cape gauge at 1,067, and meter gauge at exactly 1,000. Cheap, light, and ideal for rugged ground. Each one is a different bet on cost, capacity, and geography. And the logic behind those bets is simple. Broad gauge buys stability and capacity, wider cars, bigger loads, room for double-stacked containers. But it's expensive. Wider track beds, longer sleepers, bigger tunnels and bridges. Narrow gauge flips it. Less land, lighter materials, tighter curves, far cheaper to drive through mountains. The price is lower speed and less stability. There is no single best gauge, only the right bet for the terrain and the traffic. Which is exactly what made the history so messy. In 1835, the engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel dismissed Stephenson's gauge as a mere coal wagon standard. For his Great Western Railway, he went enormous, 7 feet and a quarter inch, promising faster, smoother, steadier trains. And for a decade, 2 incompatible networks grew side by side across Britain. Then, in 1844, they collided, at Gloucester, where Brunel's broad gauge met Stephenson's standard. Every passenger and every crate of cargo had to be physically hauled across a platform from one train to another. The chaos was so notorious it earned a name, the evil of the break of gauge. Parliament stepped in, and the Gauge Act of 1846 made standard the law. Brunel's magnificent broad gauge was eventually torn up, the very last of it converted over a single weekend in 1892. America learned the same lesson the hard way. Before the Civil War, more than 20 different gauges crisscrossed the country, and the southern states had settled on 5 feet. Wide cars, ideal for cotton bales. After the war, that incompatibility was strangling trade. So the South did something astonishing. Over 36 hours, on the 31st of May and 1st of June, 1886, tens of thousands of workers shifted around 11,500 miles of track, prying up one rail and moving it 3 inches inward, bringing the entire South into line with the northern network. A whole region re-gauged in a single weekend. Russia went the other way and kept its distance. The popular tale is that the Tsar chose a broad 5-foot gauge to stop invaders rolling their trains across the border. In truth, the choice was technical. An American engineer, George Washington Whistler, recommended 5 feet for its stability and bigger locomotives. The military advantage was an accident of history, though it did genuinely slow German armies in both world wars. In the 1960s, the Soviets nudged the standard to 1,520 millimeters for a smoother ride, and that's the gauge that still defines a seventh of the planet's railways. Spain chose broad gauge too, on the advice of an 1844 commission that argued its mountains demanded the extra stability, and in doing so walled itself off from France at the Pyrenees. Australia managed to be even more chaotic. 3 colonies, 3 different gauges, meeting head-on at the state borders. A traveler crossing the continent had to change trains again and again, a muddle not fully untangled until the last of the mainland capitals were joined by a common standard gauge in 1995. Whenever 2 gauges meet, engineers faced the same problem Gloucester faced, just with better tools. The crudest fix is still transloading. Lift the cargo across by crane, ideally inside standardized containers, so nothing has to be unpacked. You can even piggyback whole wagons onto flat cars of the other gauge. But to keep the train itself moving, you need something cleverer. The first clever answer is bogie exchange. Roll the train over a pit, lift the entire body on synchronized hydraulic jacks, slide the old wheel sets out, and roll new ones, built to the next country's gauge, underneath. The cargo never moves, so nothing is damaged. The catch is time. 30 to 60 minutes for every single vehicle. For a long train, that is a serious delay. The most elegant solution doesn't stop the train at all. Variable gauge axles, like Spain's Talgo system, let the wheels slide along their own axle. The train rolls through a trackside gauge changer at about 15 kilometers an hour. Guide rails take the weight off the wheels, an unlocking rail releases a locking pin, and diverging rails gently push the wheels outward to the new spacing, where they lock again. The train crosses a gauge boundary without ever coming to a halt. The price is complexity. A variable gauge bogie weighs about a ton more and needs disc brakes and constant maintenance. Some nations decided to end the problem for good. India inherited a patchwork of broad, meter, and narrow gauge that forced constant transfers at its own internal junctions. So in 1992, it launched Project Unigauge, a decades-long campaign to convert almost everything to a single broad gauge. More than 35,000 kilometers of track were rebuilt, trackbeds widened, tunnels enlarged, bridges strengthened. Today, around 99% of India's network runs on one gauge, and double-stacked container trains roll straight through where transfers once stood. Japan made the opposite choice and kept both. Its older network is narrow Cape gauge, perfect for threading mountain valleys cheaply. But narrow gauge can't go truly fast. So rather than rebuild the old lines, Japan built brand new, standard gauge, dedicated tracks for the Shinkansen, the bullet train. Standard gauge gives the stability for speeds past 300 kilometers an hour. Sweeping 4-kilometer curves keep it smooth. And because the bullet trains are completely isolated from the slow narrow gauge network, a delay on one can never cascade to the other. 2 gauges, 2 jobs by design. Step back, and the pattern is clear. There is no perfect gauge, only consequences. Standard gauge won the world because it balances cost against speed and lets networks connect. Broad gauge still rules where raw capacity matters most. And narrow gauge endures wherever the terrain is brutal and the budget is thin. Every workaround, the bogie swaps, the variable axles, the dual gauge track, is just engineering paying interest on a decision made a century ago. A gap between two rails, fixed by a colliery engineer 2 centuries ago, still quietly decides what your railways can carry, how fast they can run, and which borders they can cross. That is why track gauge matters. If you found this useful, subscribe to Rams Ready for more deep dives into the engineering behind the railways, and I'll see you in the next one.